Hey guys, welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you so much for being here. Happy Friday. This show is going to be on vacation next week, so just to let you know, we will not be around. You'll see some clips that are posted, but the show itself, the full show, the live stream is not going to be here next week. And no, it's not because we got censored or somebody ripped us off the internet. It's just we're on vacation. We'll be back a week after next. Tonight's guest is Whitney Webb. You guys have requested her numerous times. She's a highly requested guest. She's written a couple of new pieces we're going to break down. She's also been very critical of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s running mate, Nicole Shanahan, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself. So we're going to get into that conversation, the latest that she's kind of dug up on his VP candidate. But she does have a couple of pieces that I really want to go over today because they're very dystopian. First of all, the border fiasco. We hear constantly about an invasion, an invasion, an invasion. And Whitney says this is manufactured on purpose. Administration after administration, they've done nothing to secure the border. Why is that? Well, now there's an opportunity. And if they frame it like it's an invasion and that our national security is at risk rather than a flood of people looking for economic opportunities, which is usually the case, people looking for a better life, that's families coming in. But now we're seeing a flood of a lot of younger men coming in for work. That is for economic opportunity. But it is being framed as this is a military invasion. These Chinese men are coming in like they're going to stage some sort of a coup once they get here. We're hearing all of this rhetoric. Well, she's saying that is manufactured on purpose in order to get us to agree to some really tough surveillance measures to enact this very dystopian surveillance network that ultimately will be used against us. They can use it on the border. They start there. They start with the immigrants, with the people that are foreign, and then they move that surveillance onto us. She also talks about the credit coup. She says that the Green Plus program, which was launched in 2022, which was meant to combat climate change. She says that this is also a way to enact invasive surveillance methods. So we're going to go into that as well. Of course, many of us know that a lot of these narratives that they push on us to make us afraid, like the border invasion, climate change, they use these narratives, even if they're somewhat true, even if there's a little truth to it, they use those narratives in order to get us to go along with mass surveillance and to erode our rights. And that is what we're going to talk to Whitney Webb about tonight. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. But first, now I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people who don't feel the same after the COVID pandemic, whether they got the vaccine or they got COVID many times or they got both, which was usually the case. People who got vaccinated even multiple times ended up with COVID multiple times. And I personally know people who are just not feeling well. They still feel under the weather. They feel foggy. They don't feel like they have their energy. They really feel like that spike protein inside of COVID and inside the vaccine had a major effect on them. Well, luckily, there is something that can help you. So if you are that person, or if you know somebody who is that person, or you're just afraid that there's some residual spike proteins that are circulating, because we know now that the spike protein was the most damaging part of COVID and the vaccines. Smart of them to build that into the vaccines, right? There were other countries that did not, like Cuba, but anyway, fortunately, Dr. Peter McCullough, who we've had on this show many times, who you guys love, Dr. Harvey Risch, and the chief medical board at the wellness company have formulated what they call Spike Support. And this is a daily supplement that you take, and this will help you get back to your normal self. It's going to help clear that spike, the effects of spike protein from your system. So it helps you get back to normal. This is an over-the-counter supplement. You take it daily and clear that fog, get your energy back. If you just, or maybe you haven't gotten your cycles back to regular. A lot of women are saying that. Go grab this Spike Support. It'll help you. It's worth a shot for sure. Give it to the people you know who are also still feeling the effects. I know people who have serious long COVID, been wanting to get them this. So this is a revolutionary over-the-counter Spike Support formula. It is a gold standard for combating spike protein. So grab it. I do have the link down below, but you just got to go to twc.health/Kim. That's twc.health/Kim. Use the code Kim. You're going to get 10% off and you're going to get free shipping. So try it out for yourself. Dr. Peter McCullough is a genius. You guys have known he has been on top of this since the beginning of the pandemic. and this is, finally somebody's actually addressing, rather than them saying, oh, long COVID, this is why you don't want to get COVID and why you needed to take the vaccine so that you don't get COVID, which didn't happen. And then people ending up with long COVID and they're not really doing much to treat it. Well, Dr. Peter McCullough is, and the wonderful people at the wellness company, the wonderful doctors, the medical team there, they are doing something about it. So go get yours, twc.health/Kim. Use the code Kim, save 10% and get free shipping. All right, let's get to the show. Whitney Webb, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me, Kim.
Yeah, you're one of the best. I mean, honestly, which the audience already knows, you're highly requested. So I'm glad to have you back. Let's get into some of your latest investigation, the border. This is what's interesting about the border is typically in election cycles, the number one priority for American voters is the economy. But this one time, the border actually rises above in the polls as a greater concern for many Americans than even the economy itself. We're told we have an invasion going on. I'm seeing reports all the time of it's 40,000 Chinese nationals have been able to cross the border, right? So there's this rhetoric that's building of there's this invasion and almost like these military-aged young men are going to come in and stage a coup and take over our country. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the line of logic where it's supposed to lead to, but I think it kind of is supposed to allude to that.
Yeah.
But you say that the border fiasco or the border, the porous border is that this is intentionally produced, that they've never fixed this on purpose, administration after administration. Tell us about that. Like, why do you think it's been done on purpose?
Well, absolutely. So, if you think about the migrant situation or like the illegal immigration phenomenon and its uptick over the past several decades, it's been continuously bad and problematic, and the border has been continuously porous, and it's never been closed by anybody, Trump included. When he was in office. And when Trump was in office, of course, his campaign, his first presidential campaign rested heavily on the idea of creating a physical barrier on the US-Mexico border. But by 2019, Trump had abandoned that idea and was promoting this smart wall, the biometric, an artificial intelligence powered smart wall that functions autonomously. And this is actually something that the Bush administration first kicked off. The newly created Department of Homeland Security at the time launched this program called SBI Net, which failed and has sort of come back over the last several years or so and has been promoted both by Democrats and Republicans. So, for example, when Trump was his rhetoric about a physical barrier was being, Democrats were upset about it. Their response by and large was to promote the idea of a smart wall as opposed to a physical barrier. And this is a bipartisan agenda. And it's been creeping along the past several years rather quickly. And now, of course, what you have is, as you mentioned, this rhetoric, this renewed media attention, including an independent media being given to the border situation, which, of course, is going to get people more agitated and concerned about it. But it is something that has gone on for a long time. And I would argue that the media rhetoric about the problematic situation on the border is to argue, it is to, like you said, frame it in military style terms with the idea of manufacturing consent for a military style solution.
A military style solution that would end up being this kind of biometric surveillance system that would then, I would imagine, then they're going to turn around and use it on everybody. I mean, that's usually how that goes, right?
Well, here's the thing about the biometric entry-exit wall. This is something that is not just happening in the U.S. It is being rolled out and promoted in lockstep throughout the entire Western world. The European Union is implementing it starting this year. The U.K. is poised to do it in 2025. And it is essentially part of this broader agenda to impose digital identity or digital ID on people. And digital ID is something that a lot of people in Trump's base and people that were dissenters during the COVID era were very opposed to, because this was, vaccine passports were fundamentally the trial run for a global interoperable digital ID style system, and
Hmm.
that's essentially what these entry exit systems will be. And it's not something that's just they're trying to do on the physical terrestrial borders of the U.S. All ports of entry, including airports, are going to have this, or they're hoping to impose this on people. This new paradigm for identification for travel. And obviously, as was reported during, the COVID era with the vaccine passports, the goal is not just surveillance, but restricting people's freedom of movement on, in the case of vaccines, whether or not you've been vaccinated. But that, of course, opens the door to anything, potentially even, your social media posts or your online activity, your travel should be restricted. Or from the net zero carbon market side of things, if you've overgone, if you've spent too much, you've traveled too much this year and your carbon footprint's too big, your travel's being restricted. And all of that functionality is currently being marketed to the exact segment of the population that was against it during COVID, and they're trying to frame it with rhetoric, and with crises where they think they'll consent to this system, because obviously the digital ID system only works if there's mass compliance to it.
Oh, this is so frightening. So the very people, those of us who are very much against vaccine passports and mandates, but mostly the passport, because the passport created the mandate. I mean, you could skirt a mandate potentially, if, especially here in this country, it was like the paper. You just got the paper from the doctor if you got a vaccine, and those were easily faked, or people just say, "Oh, I lost mine, I had it," right? But when it comes to a digital COVID passport, then you wouldn't be able to go, there would be no way to really fake it very easily, right? It would be on your
Yeah,
digital ID, and that would allow, and then they could say to you, well, we're not allowing you on any public transportation. We're not allowing you to travel. We're not allowing you into the movie theater or to these restaurants, because when we scan your digital ID, you don't have proof of vaccination, right?
exactly.
So
The
a lot of
man,
us were very not okay with that. But what you're saying, and this is so scary and interesting, that now with this, but the border is more of a right wing, that the very people who are against those vaccine passports are often the same people who are very concerned about all of, like, the Chinese nationals coming in through the
mhm.
border and the invasion at the border. And so you're saying that the way they're going to enact this, it's not just like, because when I think of a border biometric security wall, I kind of think, are they just going to put a bunch of cameras up? I mean, what are they going to? I don't even, what, I don't understand the tech that they plan to implement. I'm sure you do better than I do, but you're saying that part of that would be this kind of digital ID that's created. They would be able to then sell to the public, look, we've got to keep America safe.
Oh, absolutely. And that's how they're going to sell it to the right. And they're also going to sell it sort of as a private sector initiative as opposed to a public sector initiative. But remember, all of this stuff, the digital ID agenda included, is a public private partnership. ID
Right.
2020 and those groups, that's how they function. It's a public private partnership. And so the public sector leaning rhetoric appeals to the left, private sector leaning rhetoric appeals to the right. And the other ways they're going to try and pitch this to the right, and they're already doing it, is not just through increased border security, but as an answer to the voter ID issue. Vote
Oh,
with your
right.
face. And this is already being promoted by people like Trump's lawyer, Alina Habba, and people like that on the podcast circuit, saying, why don't we have Clear, Clear being like the company at airports alongside TSA, where you can scan your eyeball, not unlike WorldCoin, and get through security faster. She was like, why not do that for voting? This is the beginning of them trying to manufacture consent to Trump's base, or rather right-leaning populists, for the same exact digital ID system that they were opposed to during COVID. Because
Clever.
it's very clever. And this is why I would encourage people to look at the current border situation as something that is being intentionally manufactured also by the Biden administration, because this is something where the Biden camp and the Trump camp agree. And precisely this intentional policy on the part of Biden's DHS is creating the situation whereby the solution that both parties want can be imposed, but the opposition, in this case, Trump, can write in and offer this solution, and his base will be clamoring for it, even though it's the exact same type of framework that was proposed during COVID. And of course, as you pointed out, the mandates were to force people to onboard onto this. So if you can't vote without digital ID, you can't get a job without digital ID. You have to prove you're an American citizen, right? Not a migrant. But the only way to do that now is with smart ID, just like the kind that Ron DeSantis, who was, opposed to all this COVID era stuff, he's already having that roll out in Florida, called exactly Florida Smart ID, and it's being produced by a World Economic Forum strategic partner based in France, Thales. So, I mean, regardless of their rhetoric, we need to pay attention to their actions. And both parties are leading us to this technocratic system. You just have some where it's being framed as a UN public sector effort, and then the ones where it's being framed by private sector Silicon Valley oligarchs like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, who are building the same exact kind of systems for the quote unquote deep state that Trump supporters are supposed to revile. And it's precisely a Peter Thiel funded company that's building the smart wall right now. And there's a lot to be said about that, because the amount of connections to the CIA in that regard are truly staggering. And so if Trump supporters knew that they're being tricked into supporting a CIA front company border wall as a way to stop migration, that's not just about keeping migrants out. That's also about, intimately tied up with the war on domestic terror agenda, which I think a lot of these people should know by now is directed mainly at them. And a lot of the groundwork for that war on domestic terror that's aimed largely at constitutional conservatives, but really also people that would be most likely to protest against government overreach. It says in the documentation that it's just about not just about targeting people on the right, but people on the left as well, if they get in the way of government policy. This system being built by Peter Thiel through Palantir and some of these other companies that are, military and intelligence contractors. The groundwork was set under Trump. It's been expanded under Biden. This is a two-party agenda to curb domestic dissent, and they have been building it for a very long time, obviously supercharged after 9/11. But they're essentially being, sheepdogged into a situation where they're cheering on their own prosecution.
Oh man, I don't know what I'm more afraid of. I don't know if I'm afraid that these people are this smart that they're able to manipulate population so easily. It's kind of just pick their soft point, right? With the left, it was COVID. They were worried about killing grandma. They wanted everybody to have these digital IDs, essentially these COVID passports to stay safe, right? It's always under the guise of we got to stay safe. And then they realized a bunch of people weren't going to fall for this. They weren't falling for it. So they said, oh, well, we'll find the thing that they can fall for. They will fall for the border. They'll fall for voter ID. I don't know if I'm more afraid that they're this intelligent that they're able to suss that out, or if we're that dumb, if we're so that we just keep falling for things over and over and over again. I mean, just like with the military industrial complex, these endless wars that we're in, for Americans, especially the Vietnam War, protesting boots on the ground. We didn't want boots on the ground. They started scaling them back. But that's when we then saw the rise of like West Exec Advisors, right? That was going around, which is Antony Blinken and Michelle Flournoy, and they were going around figuring out new ways to wage war without the troops, without as many troops, so that we would appease the American people, but we would still be able to wage war everywhere we go. So we're not actually dwindling down wars, right? We're actually quite ramping them up, but we're just doing this with drone warfare, over the top horizon stuff.
Yes. And the same company supercharging drone warfare for the U.S. military industrial complex is the same company building the smart wall. Same company. It's Anduril is the name of the company. It was co-created by Palmer Luckey and Trey Stevens. Trey Stevens used to work for a U.S. intelligence agency. He refuses to say which one. Then he went to work for Peter Thiel's Palantir. He was on the board of Carbine 9/11, which was this very suspect Israeli intelligence-connected company that was heavily funded by Jeffrey Epstein and Leslie Wexner, chaired by Ehud Barak. Trey Stevens then was a key figure on Trump's Department of Defense transition team, and essentially set up a lot of the policy agenda for Trump's Department of Defense during his first term, and then teams up with Palmer Luckey. Palmer Luckey having been the creator of the virtual reality system Oculus Rift, that was sold later to Facebook, which of course Peter Thiel is very much responsible for the rise of Facebook, if not more so even than someone like Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook would not have become the company it was today without Peter Thiel. backing
Mm.
it earlier than anybody else, and he was on the board for a very long time. And at the same time, by the way, that he was, creating and overseeing the rise of Palantir with the CIA's NQTel. So Palmer Luckey and Trey Stevens. It's Anduril is funded by Founders Fund as well, which is also Peter Thiel, and invested in Carbine and a lot of these other defense companies that are framing themselves, of course, as America first, and all of these things, and trying and basically taking the contracts, military contracts from companies like Google, when Google engineers, for example, protest about the Pentagon's use of AI drone warfare, and selling that to, for example, Israel and its wars on Palestine, and things like that. When there's those protests, Palantir, Anduril, all those guys come and scoop it up and say that we're making America great again. But really, the interest is the same thing that people like, the guy that created Blackwater, Eric Prince, has been pitching to the Trump camp for some time now. The idea of privatizing our foreign wars that will be
Hmm.
saving taxpayer money and all of this stuff. It's this play again from public to private, just like we get ping ponged from one party to the next. The answer is the opposing party from the one that's made this big mess we're in now. But really, both parties are working together to make the mess. And it's the same type of ping pong between Democrats and Republicans, between the public sector and the private sector. People forget there is a revolving door between both sectors, and it is the same group that is leading us into this agenda. Both parties, both sectors, they all collaborate, and you can't really tell where one ends and one begins at this point. It's really just rhetorical differences and maybe some narrative differences, but it's all, superficial and public facing at this point, to try and get people to really just to follow through with the age old divide and conquer
Yeah.
playbook. That's essentially
I
what's happening here. But
well,
Anduril is a very spooky company. They've been supplying autonomous drones to Ukraine, where no humans are involved in the mass murder of people based on AI facial recognition. Of course, one of the other companies that Peter Thiel has helped create is Clearview AI, which has also been contracted by the Ukrainian government and is presumably being used by this, which scraped all of the pictures off of Facebook, again connected to Peter Thiel, and has been using those pictures to create the largest database for facial recognition in the world, presumably. And it's coming together to basically create a totalitarian surveillance nightmare,
yeah.
brought to you by Peter Thiel and the CIA.
This week, I mean, I'm so glad we're talking about this stuff, and I think this is going to resonate because this week alone, I think many of us watched the collapse of the narrative that the right was the free speech anti-war party, right? There was this period of time where it was Democrats pushing all of these anti-democratic, anti-free speech things for so long that people started turning to the right, because you had people like Governor Greg Abbott saying, like, I'm for free speech on college campuses, like back in 2019 when Democrats were wanting to crack down.
Yeah.
And then we see this week, right, Greg Abbott going and sending in an entire military unit in order to crack down on college protests, and directly saying the reason wasn't because they were violent, but because they were quote unquote anti-Semitic, right? So he was saying it was because of their speech that he went after them. We're also seeing this week the passing of the bill that Republicans just said, well, it's a loan, right? Because Trump told us to tell you it was a loan. So we baked it into this bill that it's a loan, and then you read the fine print and it says, oh, it's a completely forgivable loan. The president just has to say, never mind, you don't have to pay us back. And so it's not really a loan. But it's just that the ability for them to manipulate us with with just a slight shift in rhetoric. All they have to do is just insert, oh, it's a protest you don't like, so now we could crack down on that free speech. Or, oh, we just add this little language in there, and now it's not, now it makes you, just we're so easily appeased
Mm-hmm.
that, just with a couple of words or just a slight narrative shift, when they want to give us some sort of totalitarian surveillance, dystopian infrastructure. And also about the protests, there were people cheering on that. Some people on the right were actually saying, you know what, we're going to use facial recognition to find out who all of you little protesters are. And in the future, you're not going to be able to get jobs. You're not going to be able to live your life. I
Yeah.
mean, that was on the right saying things like, we can't wait to out you. We can't wait to hunt you down.
Yeah, I guess
I
they've
mean,
forgotten about January 6th already,
right, yeah,
on their side.
right,
Yeah, which, by the way, Clearview AI, Peter Thiel's company, bragged about identifying January 6 protesters for the FBI and for law enforcement, while at the same time, its creators and Palmer Luckey and all of these guys claim to be MAGA, pro-Trump, whatever.
right,
This is not a, this is just about manufacturing consent from a large enough segment of the populace for a totalitarian police state that's underpinned by surveillance. And they've been building it for a very, very long time. And actually, Palantir was created because it was created to be the private sector version of a failed public sector version of this exact same surveillance nightmare that they tried to impose on the country after 9/11. It was called total information awareness. They put one of the Iran Contra criminals, John Poindexter, in charge of it. It was being run out of the Pentagon's DARPA. And it was just railed against rightly by the New York Times and pretty much every other mainstream media publication and the ACLU and all of these organizations, because it was going to eliminate privacy for the American citizen without a warrant. It was going to essentially gut the Constitution. And that absolutely was true. But they realized that they could eliminate those complaints by making it a purely private sector project. And so Palantir was precisely created out of that, involving the people that helped set total information awareness up, including John Poindexter, including the neocon Richard Pearl, who was in the Department of Defense under Bush. And they advised Thiel and Alex Karp about how to basically build the exact same thing. And it was done with In-Q-Tel money and extreme CIA involvement. I mean, this is a documented phenomenon. And at the same time, Peter Thiel also helped resuscitate another failed DARPA project in the same vein, known as LifeLog, and helped influence Facebook to become exactly what LifeLog was meant to be as well. So you have this surveillance apparatus that they attempted to foist upon us on 9/11. They've now, created this constellation of companies that are in the private sector to impose the same thing upon us, but it's been done by the CIA and all of this. And now we're having these people in the Trump administration, or in the Trump camp rather, for example, come around, like Eric Prince, for example, pitch the privatization of the deep state, essentially, of the foreign wars. He also pitched to create a private CIA to Mike Pompeo and all of this. And I mean, if you think it's going to be in any better deep state than to replace the CIA with, Palantir and Blackwater and all of these firms,
right.
I think people are very naive about that. It's not going to be better at all. And in fact, the CIA arguably wants to move to the private sector. And that's why they created In-Q-Tel in the first place, and why they've rebranded all of these former intelligence projects, like total information awareness is Palantir, LifeLog is Facebook, and all. And Google had CIA funding from the beginning. These extremely powerful companies that are not accountable to anyone. That's who they want to move all of this to, and they want to have the right-leaning populace cheer it on, essentially, as
I would love to have
freedom from the
yeah.
deep state.
Yeah, right. I would love to have a conversation with a libertarian about that on, how do, claiming that the free market, the idea that libertarians cling on to is that the free market does the checks and balances when it comes to the private sector, right? Well, how do you have any sort of checks and balances
Well,
on a private CIA?
yeah, well, Peter
There's
Thiel
no free market checks and balances on that.
Well, Peter Thiel frames himself as being a libertarian, but he's created the most powerful and dangerous tool for the deep state ever. That's what Palantir is. And I mean, even the New York Times referred to it as the all-seeing eye, knowing everything about you. And it's specifically designed to usher in a pre-crime surveillance paradigm. And in fact, the pre-crime surveillance paradigm, in terms of its legal underpinning, that was brought in under the Trump administration. Attorney General William Barr legalized pre-crime in the United States. And that's why we've had a few cases over the past few years of people being arrested, and in some cases even, shot at by police and killed for their social media posts. That was all done under the Trump administration. And there was also an effort that was being pitched to Trump by Jared Kushner and Ivanka to create this agency that Biden actually ended up creating, called HARPA, the Health DARPA, an ARPA for health, but Biden called it ARPA-H. He moved the H to the N to make it look slightly different, I guess, than what was being pitched and fielded in the Trump administration. But the flagship program of that was called Safe Homes, which is an acronym for something. And essentially, what that program was to have artificial intelligence comb over all of Americans' social media posts to look for early warning signs of what they called neuropsychiatric violence as a way to stop mass shootings before they start. So if your social media post suggests that you may commit a crime in the future, you could have your guns taken away. You could have be ordered to attend like a court-ordered psychologist. You could go to preventative prison. This is a Republican administration considering this proposal. And the problem is that both parties, as I've tried to write very extensively about, two books on the subject, both parties are essentially organized crime. They're run by the same mafia essentially, and what they agree about is imposing neo-feudalism on on Americans, and taking our freedom and our money away. And
And they agree on war. There's a
exactly,
few
but
things they agree on. Yeah.
that's part of the wealth transfer in the elimination of individual freedoms. Because when countries are in perpetual wartime, just look at World War I and World War II. People's freedoms and constitutional protections disappear. It happened for Japanese Americans in World War II. In World War I, it was just as extensive as that, really. I mean, they deputized regular civilians to go around and pull people out of their houses and say they were enemies of the state for being German Americans and stuff in World War I. There's a lot of forgotten history there that I think people should go back and perhaps revisit, because this is what governments, not just the United States, but including the United States, routinely do when they say, there's a national emergency and there's war. And in the Reagan administration, the same people, like Oliver North, for example, that was involved in Iran-Contra, and resurfaced in the Trump administration to propose the creation of a private CIA with Eric Prince. He was one of the point men in this idea of continuity of government, or the continuity of government protocol that was sort of came out to an extent during the Iran-Contra hearings. And what that was about is that if the government declared a national emergency under like the vaguest terms, and one of the examples of something that could trigger this was a nationwide nonviolent protest about U.S. military intervention abroad. So a massive nonviolent protest against war, they said, could trigger this. Would be, the same pre-crime paradigm, the idea of rounding up potential troublemakers before they could cause a problem and prevent the continuity of government. And so what people don't understand is that the deep state, I think a lot of people, just because of the rhetoric from independent media over the past several years, I think it's been intentionally cheapened so people don't understand what the deep state is, or what the CIA even is, and how it works. And, I think all of these very damaging entities and very problematic entities in the US government seem to be making this calculated move to the private sector to be held up sort of as saviors. They're going to collapse the public sector, the problematic parts of it. Because people know it's been found out, and trust in mainstream media has collapsed. Trust in the national security state has collapsed for a huge swath of Americans. So how do you continue with the exact same system of business as usual, but have people think that they've won? And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And I think the reason they want to do this is because when people think they have won, they are compliant. And the people they want to be the most compliant for them are the gun owners in the United States. So how do you make, the majority of gun owners in the U.S. more compliant? You make them think they won. You put someone that you've marketed to them as their guy in the White House. And they did, Trump, when he was in office, he did Operation Warp Speed. He agreed to lock down the country. They printed trillions of, an insane amount of government debt, Steve Mnuchin.
Yeah.
And the Federal Reserve and all of these guys just printed an insane amount of money. It got handed around for BlackRock to hand out. And Larry Fink had advised, had helped manage Trump's wealth before he was in office, and they have a very close relationship. And, that's complete cronyism. And now we're dealing with the effects of inflation because of, what happened during COVID. And all that stuff was really continued by the Biden administration. To think that Trump's going to come in and be any different than he was last time. Again, I think it's naive, and I think Republicans that can't see that have fallen victim to the same sort of psyop, really, that affected progressives and left leaning people during Obama, who became apologists for what Obama was doing in his second term, even when it came out that his entire cabinet was picked by Citigroup during the worst part of the U.S. financial crisis, and that he was starting war after war and having Hillary Clinton run the State Department. And people were like, oh, well, if people would just cooperate with Obama, or he has all these traitors in his government. I mean, it's the same exact rhetoric that people are putting out to apologize for Trump. And, frankly, I think the only way out of this is for people to realize that there's a bipartisan effort to impose a very dangerous agenda on the United States. Many figures have been set up to try and gain your trust to manufacture consent for those policies. And it's not just happening in politics, it's happening in media as well, because they know that mainstream media has lost everyone's trust. And so they're creating what some people now are calling this mainstream alternative media that is being used to promote and market these same policies. And so, for example, you had Brett Weinstein go on Tucker Carlson and say, we need a smart wall. You've had Colonel Douglas McGregor, who I believe had an advisory role in the last Trump administration, saying we need a smart wall. You have Trump's lawyer and senior advisor to his super PAC saying we need biometric ID for voting. This is a very insidious and dangerous effort to get people to fall into a system that we know they oppose, because they opposed it during COVID. And traditionally, these people are the segment of the population are those that are most wary of losing their individual liberties, and they are being sold and bombarded constantly with all of these figures and all of these talking points from every side of the spectrum, just to try and get people's consent to comply with this system once they roll it out. And I
And
think,
it's working.
yeah, well, I think it's working to an extent, but I think the white pill here, the positive here, is that they are investing so much money and so much time in trying to get our consent for these systems. It means that if we do not comply, they will fail. And
Well,
so,
and I think
yeah,
that is my question, is how in the world, I mean, this is just this is devastating. I mean, it's been a devastating, I'd say, few months, watching the right flip on all of the things that it seemed like they were going to be the ones that were going to champion free speech, and that they were going to be the ones,
yeah,
right? So it's like, oh, wow, there's maybe this kind of like upside down world that I'm living in right now, but hey, whatever. And now it's just really clear that no, you just have to push the right emotional buttons. And
mhm,
once you push the right emotional buttons, depending on the group, I mean, everybody's the same. It's just everybody's got a different button. That's what it seems like. And where are the true free speech, the true freedom loving people that say, I don't care if they're protesting on January 6th. I don't care if they're protesting on the college campuses now. I don't care if it's BLM, Free Palestine, Trump, no lockdowns, and Trump won the election. Whatever pick your protest. I just want the people who believe that these people have that right, regardless of what their viewpoint is and whether I
mhm,
agree with them or not. But where are those people? I mean, it just seems like we're losing. I don't know if we've changed. I don't know if we've just never really truly held that as an actual value in our culture. It's just more of like, well, you can have freedom so as long as you're saying the things that I like and doing the things
yeah.
that I like.
It's truly staggering to think about, and yeah, I definitely agree that it's unsettling. I mean, essentially, what we saw during COVID is that the progressive left, a significant amount of them, were willing to become very authoritarian and
Yeah,
totalitarian against people that didn't agree with them, right?
right,
And now we're
right.
seeing the same thing coming out of the right.
Yeah,
And that, yeah, does speak to very dangerous tendencies that exist within both parties. And I think, just think back to what was going on during the US financial crisis in 2008. Occupy Wall Street, protest against Iraq, when you had people, from left and right collaborating together. And think about how far we've fallen since then, and everything that's happened, and that's been done to try and manipulate people to this current state of mind we're in. I definitely think, I don't think I'm the best person to do it necessarily, but I think there needs to be some analysis of how we just got so far away from that, and came to where we are now, where we have people claiming to care about freedom and other people, and the what's best for the common good and all of this, willing to just give into authoritarianism whenever their emotional whenever their emotional buttons are pushed. That's
Yeah.
very dangerous stuff. And we've seen what happens when those kind of governments come in places like Latin America in the 1980s. A lot of people probably know by now that I live in South America. I live in Chile. There was a US CIA backed dictatorship here. And, some people on the American right today glorify it and make memes about throwing people out of helicopters. But people I would argue that people don't know what it was actually like here. And obviously I didn't live here during those times, so I don't know, but I've learned enough and heard stories from people, whether they're Chileans on the left or the right, to know that it was not good. I mean, you could just have an there were cases of people not liking their neighbor and saying their neighbor was a communist even when they weren't, and their neighbor being taken away and never seen again and stuff like that. This kind of system, if we usher it in, it will be, or allow it to be ushered in, it will be used to go after dissent on the right just as much as the left, and vice
Yeah.
versa. It will be anyone that stands in the way of this totalitarian machine, will be on the chopping block, and we can't allow that to happen. And I really hope people wake up to this ruse that's being used against us. And unfortunately, when it's an election year, all sorts of stuff gets thrown at people. And it's really a big test for the American public, I would say. And I really hope people see through it, and at least to an extent learned, some lessons from the COVID era. But, sometimes it's hard to know. But again, I think online rhetoric is being manipulated to unprecedented degrees. And during the COVID era, a lot of our discourse, especially our political discourse, was forced online, and our social discourse as well. If you unplug and start talking to people in your real life and in your neighborhood, you will find that you have a lot of stuff in common, and people agree about a lot of things and oppose a lot of the same things. A lot of this
Yeah.
division, this anger, this hate is being generated in unprecedented ways, online. And you have a lot of our online discourse. Take Twitter, for example. It was taken over and is controlled by someone who is a major contractor to intelligence agencies and the military.
Yeah.
And the military has invested millions upon millions of dollars to manipulate people on social media for the benefit of the so-called deep state. In fact, the Air Force had a contract in like 2014, paying I think over $100 million to find out and develop algorithms to use social media to control people like drones. That is very telling. And so I think the more we can get, maybe try and keep yourself informed as much, to an extent, but we have to protect ourselves against this unprecedented barrage of psyops, frankly. And I think one of the ways to do that is to know these broader policy agendas that are sort of held within these, Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, of which this digital ID biometric entry exit system is a core part of that. Without digital ID, none of it will work. But if we
Yeah.
allow digital ID, in comes the programmable, surveillable money, which is not just coming from central banks, it's coming from the private sector as well. So people that were anti-digital ID, like Ron DeSantis, but now pro-digital ID, he's anti-CBDC, but he'll be pro programmable and surveillable money if it's issued by JP Morgan as opposed to the
Right.
Federal Reserve. That's not any better for anyone at the end
Right.
of the day. So we need to be vigilant about these policy agendas and start, putting up barriers about all this rhetoric that's being used to manufacture consent. If we know where they're trying to take us, where both parties are trying to take us, we can look for those signs and know not to trust the people selling us those policy
Yeah.
agendas that are going to lead us to totalitarianism.
I think it's also a self-awareness that we need to have. We need to develop a, rather than like a, I'm better than you. It's kind of like
Mhm.
we sort of have this feeling like, well, that won't happen to me, right?
Sure.
Yes, the left went authoritarian crazy and they
Yeah,
fell
the
for
right
this
would
digital
never do
ID.
that, right?
Right, like, we
Mhm.
would never. I'm above that. I mean, it's even sort of the American exceptionalism of believing, like, our country could never have another revolution, or our country could never fall, like, into dictatorship like the Latin American countries. We're better than that. We're smarter than that.
Yeah.
It's those ideas that those beliefs that we have at our core of this exceptionalism that I think then allows us to be blindsided by when and then here we are, then suddenly we are in a dictatorship without
Mhm.
freedoms in this country. The right is now
Yes,
screaming for digital IDs to protect the
absolutely.
border and for
Mhm.
voting. I mean, we just have to wake up and say, no, I am not better than my neighbor that fell for it the first time or last time. I could fall for it next time. I just need to stay vigilant and know that these people are crafty, they're clever, they spend millions of dollars on analysis to find out what is the button that they can push for me specifically,
Mhm.
right? For each of us,
Mhm.
and that we should stay weary and diligent and say, whatever my fear is, that is what they're going to play
Yeah.
into. They do it every time, whatever
Mhm.
our fear is. Oh, you don't fear Ukraine and Russia? Fine, but you fear China, right? So now we're gonna usher you
Mhm.
into more
Mhm.
war, but on a different side of the globe. I mean, this is how they do it, and I think we just have to have a
Yeah.
lot of awareness on that. I want to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Nicole Shanahan, because this is, the big question now is, okay, if Biden, we've already seen what the Democrats have been doing over the last few years. We already know that they're authoritarian and totalitarian and want all this surveillance. Trump now, unfortunately, it's become a lot clearer to a lot of people that Trump is no different, willing to usher in the same things, willing to print a bunch of money, willing to spend money on wars. Then we've got I mean, what are our options here? What do we do? We're coming up on an election here in November. We've got pretty much three choices, three more. I mean, there's definitely other options out there, other people running for president, but we really have like three viable options potentially. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Nicole Shanahan, you say are no better.
You know, um, I haven't really been paying a ton of attention to everything Robert F. Kennedy has been saying as part of his platform. I know some of his rhetoric is relatively similar to what it was before he ran for president on certain issues, but obviously his stance on Israel and the Gaza war, as it relates to his supposed anti-war stance, has shown that. In my opinion, if you can be pressured by something into by the Israel lobby, then the big pharma lobby or any lobby will just go through Israel to manipulate you
Right.
in your
Right.
candidacy or your presidency. Um, so I think that's very disturbing. And if he, I know that recently he has gone around saying stuff that he said before about how endless war is bad. It's fueled by money printing, and this benefits people like BlackRock. But BlackRock, and he'll talk about that in Ukraine. But I mean, a lot of these same entities it's the same with Israel in their war
Right.
machine. And
Right.
so if it's going to be okay for one country to do it and for us to print money and then give a lot of that money we're printing away to Israel with no conditions at all, the situation can arise where that same stuff could happen for any country. If you'll allow it for one, you can be pushed to allow it for more. So, I find that extremely disappointing. I think there
Yeah,
is
me
no
too.
anti-war candidate in the race, as much as people would like to think that. But obviously, if you're willing to overlook the use of artificial intelligence by the IDF to wantonly murder people who have no provable ties to Hamas, and to also ignore the fact, I was on RFK Jr.'s podcast a few years ago talking about the CIA connections to the Ukraine conflict and how, Azov Battalion and a lot of these other entities have intimate CIA connections and how the CIA may have helped instigate that conflict to begin with. And he was very open to that. But the idea that, Netanyahu help create Hamas as it is today and wanted
Yeah.
Hamas to win in the Gaza Strip and likes having them for the use of a boogeyman so Israel can continue to be under a state of military emergency that it's been in since its founding in 1948. And continue a lot of these policies that are just as bad as what Zelensky does to a significant degree. I find that very, very, very troubling and unsettling. And as far as wanton money printing goes, Nicole Shanahan was managing a project. Not that long ago about how to enable more quantitative easing on the part of the government, quantitative easing being central bank money printing, by enabling carbon markets. And this is something also that RFK Jr. in the past has been promoting the idea of solving global warming by unleashing the free market and all of this. And I find this
Mhm.
really troubling as well, because if you actually look into where carbon credit trading came from, it is the brainchild of this man named Richard Sander, who is the father of financial futures, the father of derivatives, and also the father of carbon trading. And he was a senior vice president at Drexel Burnham Lambert in the 1980s when they engaged in the junk bond scandal that was led, by Michael Milken. And, that was a major financial scandal, caused major economic harm to the US economy and a lot of other stuff as well. And Richard Sander, made millions off of that. And then right after, invented carbon credit trading, and wants to create a private market for clean water and air and all sorts of stuff. And he's also the guy behind the collateral mortgage obligation, which gave us the 2008 financial crisis. And when people look at the existing carbon credit market, they've found time and again that most of the credits that are issued are completely worthless and meaningless. And even under their own metrics of saving the planet, they don't do anything to help the planet. So they've been criticized by people who don't believe in the climate change narrative and people who do. It's widely seen as being grift prone and fraud prone. And the answer that we've been given to that is instead to add an insurance later. So make a new market for the insurance industry and have them insure carbon credits so that the fraud and the grift and all of that can continue. But now you can get insurance for it. But it's not about saving the planet. This is about creating new markets. It's created and promoted by bankers. And frankly, the people that have created the UN Sustainable Development Goal system are bankers. It's people like Mark Carney. It's people like Mike Bloomberg, who may be best known for being mayor of New York, but he's a Solomon Brothers Wall Street guy.
Yeah.
And, these are the people that have essentially designed that. And it's not about saving the planet at all. It's about making a new market. And the idea that Shanahan would think it was a good idea to basically enable this type of carbon market as a way to, basically as a place to stuff US government debt that's generated by extreme fiscal irresponsibility, I think that is extremely troubling. I also think it's troubling as well that the person that she chose to put in charge, or rather manage her personal foundation, is a career person from Open Philanthropy, whose current venture alongside Shanahan's foundation is, funded pretty much exclusively as well by Dustin Moskovitz, the Facebook co-founder that the vast majority of his wealth is in Open Philanthropy as well. And Open Philanthropy was the sole funder of Event 201 before COVID, something that RFK Jr. has routinely criticized.
Yeah.
So, and perhaps even just as troubling is that Open Philanthropy, that particular organization, had a lot of ties to Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX and the broader effective altruist movement in Silicon Valley, which is a very troubling movement the more that you look into it. And it's one of those things that you see also with some of the UN Sustainable Development Goal stuff. This idea of hiding predatory policy behind a guise of altruism. That's effectively what effective altruism is for a lot of these Silicon Valley oligarchs. Remember, Shanahan was married to Google's Sergey Brin.
Mhm.
And it's also what the UN is doing, saying, oh, we're doing this to save the planet, and we have to implement these policies to save the planet. Digital ID is not going to save the planet, but it's within the Sustainable Development Goals that we're told we must implement, or everyone on the planet and everything alive will essentially die or boil alive. I mean, that's sort of the rhetoric that comes out of the UN for this. And on its face, it's completely insane, because if you look at the SDGs, only one of the Sustainable Development Goals deals with climate at all. The rest are about
Mhm.
overhauling our way of life. And it's essentially about creating this totalitarian system. And if you listen to people like Larry Fink of BlackRock, who's been a WEF board of trustee and is involved with some of these UN efforts for green finance, and has also been involved with the Biden administration and the Trump administration as well, he's on record saying markets like totalitarian governments. This
Yeah.
is about the bankers wanting to create a new system of finance because their Ponzi scheme that they've been running is at, the end of its life, basically. So how do they not get left holding the bag? They want to impose a new system on us. And
Yeah.
that system for them for market predictability purposes, also needs, this AI surveillance paradigm that has, the bankers like that because it makes markets very predictable and makes people very predictable, among other
Yeah.
things. But yeah, I mean, totalitarian governments impose economic policy agendas developed by an economic elite on the populace, and that's why they like them, and that's why we're moving to this neo-feudal model. And you could argue in the United States we're already here because the Silicon Valley oligarchs fund both parties and set these policy agendas. So maybe Bill Gates has been vilified by the right, but we have Elon Musk and Peter Thiel on the right enacting the exact same policies, essentially, and manufacturing consent for them and paying people in independent media to promote them as our saviors. It's completely insane.
We're just going to have to stay very vigilant, I think, is what it really boils down to. Stay vigilant. But again, when it comes to this election, I don't know what our options are. I would like to see somebody who actually does uphold the values, American values that we think we have. I would like to see somebody run, like maybe a Thomas Massey. I don't know, but then I'm afraid to say his name, and you probably have all this dirt on him. It's like
No,
there's
I
nobody
actually
good.
don't. I think, as far as congressman goes, Thomas Massey seems quite principled, but unfortunately,
Yeah,
when you have one or two principled congressmen out of several hundred, the
right.
difference it makes is rather insignificant, which is unfortunate. But I
Yeah,
think the only way to really get out of this is for Americans to understand that no matter who we get in the White House, it's not going to fix things. The only way to fix things is to fix them at a local level, at the community level, take individual responsibility back, and start building resilience to all this crazy stuff they're trying to enact on us at the local level. That's really all we can do, because we're being given hero after hero that's controlled opposition or leading us astray or leading us to these disastrous policy agendas that could, essentially enslave the human race and stuff. I mean,
yeah,
it's just absolutely sinister, and the only way to not get sucked into that is to not comply. How do we not comply? We start building local resilience systems that we can use instead of the systems they're going to try and impose on us. So
yeah,
if you're, require their digital ID in this system to do anything, we have to find ways where we can still continue to live our lives and do stuff with our communities and not be
yeah,
left isolated like we were during COVID. And COVID really should have been the wake up call for all of these things. But as we've talked about today, a lot of the people that saw through and realized what was going on under COVID and what they were testing out are being psyoped right now into cheering on the exact same thing, as
right,
long as we'll own the left and own the woke and all of this stuff.
right.
Um, and I think people just really need to snap out of it and realize that we're being had and that we have to stop totalitarianism that's being foisted upon us by both parties. And again, the reason they're investing and have invested so much money and time in this is because our compliance is essential. And so if we do
Yeah,
not comply and we do not participate, it fails. And I think that's what people need to keep in mind, because that ultimately means that the power does rest with us. But we have
yeah,
to break this cultural conditioning that we need a political savior to get us out of this mess. We are the saviors that we have been waiting for. It's time to build something as Americans with other Americans and stop hoping that these puppets are going to do something for us. It's time for us to actually do something about it and not be these like armchair activists or, I'm just going to tweet and that's enough. It's not enough. It's time to build something locally that will have an impact on your lives and your loved one lives and your friends' lives. I think that's really the only way forward.
Whitney, thank you so much. Well said. Thank you so much for being here and giving us this insight, this eye-opening insight. I hope that this shoves people wide awake. Really appreciate it. Where can people? I do have the links down below to both of your recent pieces: Debt from Above, the Carbon Credit Coup, and also Manufacturing Consent, the Border Fiasco, and the Smart Wall, which we've talked about today. So I do have those links for unlimited hangout there. Is there anywhere else people can find you, or is that good?
Yeah, well, my most recent article on the carbon credit coup is also available at Bitcoin Magazine. I've been collaborating with their
Okay,
editor in chief, Mark Goodwin, on some of my recent articles. But in general, unlimitedhangout.com is where you can find all my stuff as well as my
great.
podcast. I'm not really on social media as much anymore. I would encourage people in general to go right to the source, as social media becomes increasingly manipulated. And they've told us for a long time that as we get closer to the election, social social media will get more and more censored. So if there's media outlets that you really enjoy following, whether it's me, Kim, or anyone else, please go directly to the source, to the website or our newsletters or something like that, because we need to take out these corrupt middlemen as much as possible.
Yeah. Whitney, thank you again. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. My pleasure.
All right, guys, that is it for today's show. A lot of information. Whitney Webb is one of the best independent journalists out there. So brilliant, so detailed in her research. Absolutely love her. She is one of my favorites, if not my favorite. Thank you guys for watching. Those links are down below to read the articles. They are the manufacturing consent one's not as long as the credit coup one, but the credit coup one is that will blow your mind. So read it when you get a chance. Thank you guys for this great for this. I don't know what I was just going to say to you guys, like, because I'm going on vacation. So I'm trying to say goodbye for now. Thank you for watching the show. Thank you guys for being here. I'll be back in a week. So not this Monday, we're going to be out for vacation, but the Monday after that, we'll be back. So not only have a great weekend, have a great week. Hopefully you enjoy vacation time yourself. And I will see you in about a week. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye-bye.